Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 119, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I know I told you in the last episode that there probably wouldn't be a podcast this week, but I actually came home from Seattle a day early, and I thought I would go ahead and do a podcast for this week. So both of my girls live in Washington State. One lives on the Olympic Peninsula and the other one lives in Seattle. And I went to visit the one who lives on the Olympic Peninsula. She and her husband just bought a house last fall, and it came with a garden and a greenhouse, and she asked if I could come over and help her get her garden in. And of course, the week before I got there, it was gorgeous. This week it's supposed to be gorgeous, and last week it was cold and rainy. But we did manage to get some work done, and we got some of the plants in. I left her house on Friday morning and drove back to Seattle, and I go by way of Bainbridge Island so that I can take the ferry over from Bainbridge Island to downtown Seattle. And on that route, I stopped at a lovely little quilt store in Poulsbo called Sherry's Cozy Quilts. I've been by there a number of times, but it's almost always on a Monday when they aren't open. And this happened to be a Friday, and they were open, so I stopped in. And I was greeted so warmly and personally when I walked in that I thought, even if I don't need anything, I'm going to buy something from this store because I really appreciated that. There is a yarn store right next to that quilt store, and I had been in the yarn store previously on another trip and had been completely ignored. So if you are a store owner, I would encourage you, you don't have to go overboard, but acknowledge the people that come into your store. I did end up buying 2 yards of a Tim Holtz print and some chicken fabric, which are my standby fabrics if I ever visit a store and don't know what to buy, although that's hardly ever a problem. But it was nice to stop in, and I'm sure I will be going back to that store. I thought about doing the Pacific Northwest shop hop because I was visiting so many stores, but I didn't get my act together, and I might do it next year. After I left that store, I drove to the Bainbridge Island Ferry Terminal, and in downtown Bainbridge, there is a cute little store called Esther's Fabrics, and I had about 20 minutes to kill, so I popped in there to see what they had, and I came out with a beautiful Figo rayon woven fabric, and that's going to be a top, probably, because I am woefully short on tops right now, and I need to start thinking about what I'm going to make to wear at BU. So that particular piece of fabric came home with me. It's an absolutely gorgeous royal blue with flowers on it. And then I took the ferry back to downtown Seattle, and Pacific Fabrics is a quick little 5-minute trip from the ferry terminal to their store. So of course I went to Pacific Fabrics, and I could have bought lots of fabric there, but I'm really trying to scale back. So I bought a yard of a cotton and steel canvas because I want to make the Noodlehead Oxbow tote. And the canvas that I bought has blueberries on it, but if you've ever been to Montana, you know that we have huckleberries here. And I'm going to call those berries on that canvas huckleberries instead of blueberries. And that was the extent of my shopping for fabric on this trip. I met my daughter and her fiancé for dinner, and we talked about wedding plans. One of the items on my list to converse with her about was the colors that she's picked out for her wedding. It's at the end of August of 2027, and she has chosen brown and cream for her colors. And she knows that her mother cannot wear brown without looking like a corpse. So I asked her if it was all right if I wore green, because she's also going to have a lot of greenery. And she said that was fine. And I'm planning to make my dress, so I'm going to start shopping for some lovely emerald green, probably a brocade or something like that. But that got me to thinking about color, and on the drive home, I was pondering how I would approach that from a sewing standpoint. So today we're going to be talking about color. I actually came home, as I said, from Seattle a day early. The Airbnb that I usually stay in, which I've stayed in more than half a dozen times, it's very convenient to my daughter. It's a little apartment that's done up in mid-century modern furnishings. It's absolutely adorable. It's very convenient. Unfortunately, it was booked this past weekend, so I rented another Airbnb, which was billed as a tiny home, and that didn't bother me so much because I've stayed in Airbnb tiny homes before, and they've been quite comfortable, but this was a very, very, very tiny home, and it probably should have been described as a tiny room. It was about 10 feet by 10 feet with a bathroom and a Murphy bed that pulled down, and when the Murphy bed was down, there literally was no room for anything else. So I had to put my suitcase under the sink in the bathroom. I was not very comfortable. It was in a neighborhood that was difficult to get in and out of, so I ended up parking my Jeep next to the Airbnb, and my daughter and her fiancé ferried me around. So I decided to come home a day early. My back is really bothering me from sleeping on that Murphy bed, and I may end up making a trip to the massage therapist or the chiropractor if I can't get it straightened out. And as I said, I thought I would talk about color today and how that factors into our sewing lives. And I definitely will talk about it with regard to both quilting and sewing and garment making, because I think it pervades every single aspect of our sewing and deserves to be considered from all of those angles. I have a very particular relationship with color, and I think it goes back to when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. Getting your colors done was a big thing, and determining what season you were was a big thing. And I am, in my family, an onion in the petunia patch. So all of my cousins were, I'm pretty sure they were springs, and my mother is an autumn, I'm pretty sure, and my sister is an autumn, and I was the lone winter among the group. Although I come by it honestly, my father had black hair, his mother had black hair, my mother's father had black hair. So I have very dark hair, although it's going gray now, and I have what I would describe as steel blue eyes, but they could also be considered gray, and I fit quite obviously into the category of a winter. But in a family where everybody else was a different season, especially my mother, My mother and I have completely different tastes in clothing, and I cannot buy clothing for her, and she cannot buy clothing for me. I picked out a blouse for her one year that was a deep saturated teal color, and she never wore it because that's just not a color that she's comfortable in. I ended up wearing that blouse quite a bit. When we go shopping, she tends to pull out navy blues and burgundies and browns for me, and I have to remind her that I need hot pink and royal blue and emerald green. So we've just given up trying to buy clothing for each other. So I think that's where it all started. And when we moved out to Montana and built our house and I had to decorate, I ended up painting most of the rooms very bright colors because a friend of mine who lives in Minnesota said something to me one time about the fact that if you live somewhere where there is snow up to 9 months out of the year, the last thing you want to do is paint the inside of your house white. And I took that to heart. So my kitchen is a color called pesto green. The living room is a very deep red. And our bedroom is a bright sunny yellow. I do not find these colors jarring. I actually find them energizing. And I think that just goes back to my personal preference. My children, on the other hand, much prefer neutrals in their decorating schemes, but they are living different lifestyles than I live, and they are adults and they can decorate how they want to decorate. So I find this all very fascinating, and I thought that we could explore it from a sewing perspective. I'm going to do a little basic color theory to start, and then we'll talk about quilting, and I'll circle back to garment sewing. I have to give a quick shout out here to my high school art teacher, Miss Fury, because she really was instrumental in giving me a foundation for all of this. I only took art for the first year of high school. Part of that was because I had to take other classes, college prep classes. Part of it was also because I never thought of myself as an quote-unquote artist. My sister has a lot of art talent. She took art lessons for a while, and she's very good. I'm adequate, but I truly did enjoy my year of art in high school, and I think that was mostly due to Miss Fury. And I actually went back to my hometown about 15 years ago and popped into an antique store where she was the manager and thanked her for everything that she had done for me. Sadly, she is no longer with us, but I have fond memories of her art class. She was a very elegant lady, always dressed in skirts or dresses, kept her hair up in a beautiful bun. She also, I'm pretty sure, was a winter because she had very black hair. And she just gave us a good grounding in everything that we would need to know, even if we never became artists. So let's do a quick and dirty overview of the color wheel. There are primary colors which cannot be made by mixing, and those are red, yellow, and blue. Between them, you have the secondary colors, orange, green, and purple. So if you mix red and yellow, you get orange. If you mix yellow and blue, you get green. If you mix blue and red, you get purple. And then you have what are called tertiary colors, which are created by mixing a primary and a secondary. So like teal, which is blue and green. The color wheel also breaks down into warm and cool colors, and as you would expect, those on the red, orange, yellow part of the color wheel are going to be warm, and those on the blue, green, and purple part of the color wheel are going to be cool. And we're going to come back to that in a minute because that can be important, especially when garment sewing. So each color has 3 components. The first one is hue, and that is the actual color. The next component is value, and that is how light or dark that hue is. And finally, saturation, and that is how intense or muted the color is. If you add white to a color, you get a tint, and that means that you make it lighter. If you add black to a color, you get a shade, and that means that you make it darker. And if you add gray to a tint, that means you get a tone, which is muted. So one of the projects that we did in our freshman art class in high school was known as 88 squares. And everyone in school knew what 88 squares was because all of the art students were working on this at one time or another. So what we did was take a large sheet of paper and make a grid of 11 by 8 2-inch squares. And within each square, we had to draw some kind of pattern. And each square had to be unique. We could not repeat the pattern anywhere in the grid. Once we had drawn in our patterns, then we had to choose 2 complementary colors. So complementary means that they are opposite on the color wheel. Think orange and blue, green and red, yellow and purple. I chose orange and blue, and then we could take orange and blue and mix each of those with white, black, or gray to make a tint, a shade, or a tone. And then we painted the different squares using those colors. This was not a quick project. I think we probably each took about 2 weeks to make these 88 square projects. And I remember that we agonized quite a bit over our patterns and over our colors. But they turned out really cool. And I wish I still had mine, because at this point in my life, I would probably frame it and hang it somewhere because I thought it was such a cool project. And in fact, I have sort of an 88 squares quilting project happening. As I get scraps of orange or blue fabrics, I cut them into 2.5-inch squares, and I am just randomly sewing them all together. And no doubt I'm going to end up with far more than 88 squares when this is done, but it's a similar concept. And I wanted to translate it from what we did in freshman art class to what I'm doing now. When I was knitting from about the time that I was in college until maybe 15 years ago, I had a lot of trouble with color. And it's one of the reasons that I specialized in Aran and cable knit sweaters, because I wanted the complexity, but I didn't feel comfortable or competent in putting colors together. So things like Fair Isle knitting was that just felt way out of reach to me. And looking back now, I'm trying to give myself a little grace. I don't think that it was entirely my fault. I'm drawn to bright colors, and bright retina burning colors are not what you see much in stranded color knitting, or at least not very often. Even Kay Fassett, now that I've taken a quilt class from him, I understand a little better, but part of me does not know how he throws colors together with such abandon. I do better now than I used to, and I think that quilting really helped that. But I'm still not sure that at this point I could design a Fair Isle sweater and come up with something cohesive and attractive. When I did my master knitting certificate from TKGA, from the Knitting Guild of America, we had to either design a Fair Isle sweater or a cabled sweater. And if we did a cabled sweater, we had to design a Fair Isle beret. So I did the beret, and I did bright colors. I did green and bright pink and bright blue and yet a little bit of yellow. And that is about the extent of my color knitting. So let's talk about color when it comes to quilting. I've been given some advice over the years, and some of it I think is really worth considering. And one of those pieces of advice is to choose the colors that you like together, because as you build your stash, eventually most colors are going to work together because you're choosing things that you like. So when I choose fabrics, if you were to go through my stash, most of my stash is bright saturated colors. I am not much for Civil War fabrics. I don't do neutrals very well. Probably cream and brown are the smallest bins of fabric that I have. So just learn to trust your instincts when it comes to choosing colors. And you can always buy fat quarters. They're not terribly expensive, and you don't need a lot of fabric sometimes to do a quilt. And fat quarters are a lot of fun to experiment with. Another piece of advice I was given was to buy a quote-unquote hero fabric. So maybe a print that has several colors in it that you like, and pull 3 or 4 of those colors out of the print and find other fabrics to coordinate with it. You can also use the registration dots that they're putting in the selvages now. And sometimes I find that very helpful because it lets me see that color. You don't want to go overboard though. 3 or 4 colors is plenty. And you can do variations on those colors, because another concept that you want to keep in mind is that you want contrast. You want contrast between the lightest lights and the darkest darks. If everything you've chosen is in the middle of the range, the quilt is going to look kind of blah. And one way to avoid this is to either take a black and white picture of your quilt layout or use those special glasses that knock out the color so that you can see. And if you look at your quilt and all you see is gray, you probably don't have enough contrast in your quilt. Mary Fonz likes to talk about rogue fabrics. So let's say that you've put together a palette of fabrics that you like. You need to throw in something that upsets the balance just a tiny little bit. You don't want the rogue fabric to come in and destroy the cohesiveness of your quilt, but you want it to add just a tiny little bit of visual tension. So I'm toying around with making a quilt for my daughter's future mother-in-law, and she lives on the shores of Lake Michigan, and she really likes those beachy lake colors, which I totally get, having grown up on the shore of Lake Erie. But I think once I get the final palette put together, I might throw in, so this is going to be predominantly blues and browns and sands, but what about a little bit of yellow or a little bit of orange? Something that just zings it up a little bit. And I think that that's what Mary Fonz is getting at when she talks about a rogue fabric. My grandmother loved flowers, and one time she and my cousin Lynette and I were putting together some flower pots for Lynette's porch, and we had gone to the nursery and gotten flowers, and my grandmother said that the key is no matter what you have in your basket or in your flower pot, always add a tiny little bit of yellow. And I've tried to follow that when I do flowers. I don't do them quite as well as my grandmother, but I'd like to think that she would appreciate my efforts. Yellow goes a long way, a little bit of it. And yellow, we'll get into this in a minute, but yellow is one of those colors that I absolutely love, but I cannot wear, at least not close to my face. So when we had the K-Facet workshop last September, and he took each of us around the store and asked us what color we wanted to make our quilt, I think I surprised him a bit when I said yellow, because everybody in the class was doing purples and greens and blues and pinks and reds, and I think I was the only person in there with yellow. And watching him walk around and choose fabrics was fascinating, because yellow encompassed everything from a greenish yellow to an orange yellow to a pure yellow to, it was everything goes. And I was doing the economy block quilt, and when it came to doing the centers, throwing a little bit of purple in there just absolutely made that quilt sing. I really need to finish it. The top is put together. I need to to sandwich it with some batting and a backing and get that quilted and finished, because I'm really pleased with the way it turned out. Every so often, I do try to step outside my comfort zone. So one of the reasons I started quilting in the first place was because above the stairs going to the second floor of my house was a very large area that needed something. It's probably 5 feet wide by about, 10 feet tall. And I always thought that a quilt would look nice there. And would you believe that it took me 10 years to actually make one to fit that space? The color of the walls is the color bagel that we get from Sherwin-Williams, that most of the rental houses painted that color. It's just a very warm beige. And I wanted a quilt that would fit in that space and complement those colors. I ended up using a line of fabric that I got at Joann Fabrics, believe it or not. And the colors were cream and gray and black with a warm pumpkin. It sounds hideous, but I absolutely love that print. So I bought all of the fabrics in that line, and I actually came home and rated my stash for some that I thought coordinated well with it. And I did a very simple block that ended up being, I think, 5 inches square when it was finished, but it's an O. That's the best way to describe it. It's a circle. It's done with partial seams. I absolutely love the way it turned out. It is not a color palette that I would ever wear, for sure, but it's also not a color palette that I would put anywhere else in my house. But in that particular spot, it is perfect, and I love to look at it when I go upstairs. So I would say, even if you've got a particular aesthetic that you like, most of my quilts are pretty retina burning. But every so often, I feel the need to maybe do some neutrals or step out and do a color palette that I normally wouldn't choose. If you're feeling a little unsure of your color choices when it comes to a quilt, certainly using a line of fabric from a designer or a fat quarter bundle. A lot of quilt stores will make up fat quarter bundles, and I even know a few quilt stores that will curate bundles that may not necessarily come from the same designer, but the colors and the fabrics and the textures all go together well. So before we run out of time, I want to move over to garment sewing and talk a little bit about personal color. So there are a couple of schools of thought about this. I know people who will only wear colors that are in their personal color palette, and I know people who throw caution to the wind and wear anything that they want. And I think that if it makes you happy, you should wear it, even if it's not a quote-unquote approved color for your particular skin tone and hair color and eye color. But I also think that for myself, it's very obvious to me when I wear colors that aren't flattering, so I tend to stay away from those. I absolutely adore a good mustard yellow, but the only place I will wear it is on the lower half of my body. So when my cousins and my aunts and my mother and my sister and I did our colors back in the 80s, things were broken up into 4 seasons. You were either a spring, summer, winter, or fall. And it has to do with your underlying skin tone, whether it's cool or warm. Remember, cool colors are blues, greens, purples. Warm colors are oranges, reds, and yellows. It has to do with your hair color, and it has to do with your eye color. In the past several years, that 4-season system has been expanded and refined, and now it's more like a 12-season system. So within each of those 4 seasons, there are subgroups that may be bright or dark. And again, I'm just scratching the surface here. If this is something that you're interested in, there are lots of resources on the internet, and I would advise you to search out those resources or use someone who is trained in helping people discover their color season. So again, as I said, I'm a winter, and one of the characteristics of a winter palette is a good deal of contrast. So I have dark hair and very fair skin. I have cool undertones, so I like the cooler palette, and I gravitate toward blues and greens. Not purple so much. I'm not a big fan of purple, but blues and greens for sure, as well as hot pink, which has always been kind of my signature color. Give me a good hot pink any day. I've had hot pink coats. I've had hot pink sweaters. I love hot pink. I am most definitely a bright winter. I like the bright, saturated colors. Some winters gravitate more toward the deep jewel tones. My husband says I dress like a parrot, and I have had people tell me that they don't feel comfortable in bright colors, and I totally get it, but boy, bright colors make me feel vibrant and alive, and they are truly dopamine dressing for me. My older daughter has very blonde hair and blue eyes, cornflower blue eyes, and she has always looked great in that cornflower blue. It's a fabulous color on her. She looks great in burgundy. I think she's probably a spring. Those are the colors that she tends to gravitate toward. My younger daughter has more of my mother and my sister's coloring, and she looks fabulous in neutrals. So camel or red. I have a lot of trouble with red because if it leans the tiniest little bit toward orange, I have problems with it. So I generally steer clear of red. So those are the things that I have identified over the years as the colors that really make me happy. So look through your closet. What do you gravitate toward? When you go shopping, what do you gravitate toward? I'll tell you, shopping is frustrating for me, not only from a fit standpoint, but also because finding bright colors is fairly rare. There was a period of time for about 2 decades when all you could find was muddy earth tones and teal, and I got heartily sick and tired of teal. Teal is a color that looks reasonably good on lots of people, and I just couldn't stand it anymore. During that period of time, I wore a lot of black and white because I look good in black and white, and I could find black and white. So learning to sew my own clothes has not only been about learning to sew clothing that fits me, but also being able to sew clothing in colors that I like and find flattering. It's not easy because I know what a quilt store is looking for when they're ordering apparel fabric. I've talked to Ashley about this when she's ordering apparel fabric for the store, and you can't order a lot of colors that aren't going to sell. So what's going to sell? I think winters are probably underrepresented in the population, and most people are going to gravitate toward the muddy earth tones, the burgundies, the grays, the browns, the taupes, those colors. Those are the colors that are going to sell. Bringing in parrot colors is a risky proposition. I totally get it. It's part of the reason that I love using wide backs, cotton sateen wide backs, to make garments, because you can get Tula pink in a cotton sateen wide back. You can get K facet in a cotton sateen wide back. And holy cow, I would dress in nothing but K facet if I could. So truly, I would encourage you, search out some resources and try and determine what your color season is. If you're making your own clothing, you don't have to slavishly follow that unless you want to, but it will give you some guidance as to what colors look good on you and what colors make you happy, not only when you're wearing them, but when you're sewing with them. Okay, that really only scratched the surface of color theory and using color in your sewing, but hopefully it will get you started if that's something that you're interested in. Let me know what you think. What are your feelings about color, either wearing it or quilting with it? Are you happy with the selections of colors that you see in stores, or would you like something else? I really appreciate the feedback that I've been getting, the show suggestions. I am trying to follow up on them. Sometimes I may not do a topic or an interview because I've done something similar recently, or I might contact people. This happens a lot. It happens more than you would think. I contact people and they never get back to me. I do make a good faith effort to follow up on suggestions, but they have to fit into my scheduling, and people have to respond to my queries. So I think that's one of the things that has surprised me most is how hard it is to get people to agree to be on the podcast. I guess a lot of people just don't want to hear themselves on the radio, as it were. So but thank you, and please keep the suggestions coming. You can use the fan mail feature, which I can now reply to. I couldn't do that before, but they've recently added a reply feature. You can leave a comment on the show notes page, and the podcast website is at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. You can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. My website is www.janetzabo.com, and that has links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website as well as my blog, which is where you get to see pictures of the farm and what I've been working on. I expect that there will be lots of baby animal pictures coming up and pictures of plants because that's the season that we're in right now. So thank you so much for listening. Please, if you're inclined, go over and leave a review at Apple Podcasts or Spotify because that really does help other people to find us. The podcast continues to grow steadily, and I thank you for all of your feedback and input and sharing the link and telling your friends about it. So until our next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.